Hello and welcome to Investigative Math. In this video, we're going to be talking about how you can qualify for state in UIL mathematics. All right, first thing we're going to talk about is probably the most important step in this whole process, and that's to solidify the math that you've learned so far. I would say that even if you're confident, going through something like Khan Academy or like the course challenges on Khan Academy to make sure that you don't have any gaps in your earlier math experience is going to really help you learn more advanced math later on because you're not dealing with a shaky foundation. Um, like I said, I like Khan Academy for this because I mean this is the entire thing that Khan Academy is meant to do, right? They have mastery challenges, right, for the sole purpose of making of filling in gaps for people that struggle with math. And I mean, and if you're watching this video, I'm assuming you don't struggle with math, but maybe like you're trying to get ahead and the stuff that and like the math ahead is something you're struggling with. So that's why I recommend Khan Academy. Um, this whole process I also recommend doing without a calculator, except for like calculator active practices, obviously, right? Like some statistics and calculus, it's very difficult to do without a calculator by hand. And this will really just make sure that concepts sink in because you'll be spending more time with it. Um, you'll get faster at just like the mental process of it, which will help your speed later on. And I'm just gonna say like if this is the first thing you're seeing and you're already like, well, that seems like a lot of work. I'm not sure if I want to do this. Well, first of all, this is pretty easy practice, right? Like if you're a junior right now, right? If you're a junior and you're on the advanced track, you're probably taking like calculus or pre-calculus, if, depending on the school, obviously. Um, but if you're watching this video, I'm assuming that you can't answer like all 40 of the like all first 40 questions on the math test, which is really just like algebra, geometry, algebra 2, and pre-cal, right? And the reason for that is because your foundation isn't strong enough. So this is a really quick way to improve your score really quickly to start off. Um, if you do this, your score will improve very quickly, and then after the fact, whenever you're trying to learn new math to get it even further, that process will then be easier because your foundation is stronger. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is how to work through a test. And when I say work through a test, I mean whenever you're practicing, not when you're taking a test, but whenever you're practicing, how should you work through the test to maximize your time? Because I know you guys are probably really busy. So I would say work in groups of 20, and the reason I say in groups of 20 is because the difficulty on each section is roughly like arranged in this way. Um, Again, like it's not like a hard and fast thing, but it's just a good guideline to go off of. And I'll talk a little bit more about these groupings later. And then when practicing a new test or a new set of 20, I want you to take 2 minutes before you actually work any of the problems and mark each problem with either a Q, an S, an X, or a C. So Q stands for quick, which means like you're reading it and you look at the problem and you're like, yes, I can do that in X amount of time, where it's up to you to decide what a quick problem is. For me, usually a quick problem is something I can do in less than like 30 seconds or 45 seconds. But the big part of it is you can see like the pathway from start to finish on how you're going to do it. So your only limiting factor really is how quickly you can type on your calculator or how quickly you can just do the basic operations on paper. And then S stands for solvables. So solvables maybe are like things that look familiar and you think you could solve them, but you don't like in your brain you don't already have like a framework on how to do it. Maybe you have to play with it a little bit, but it does seem familiar and you're pretty sure that if you give it like a minute or so that you could figure it out. X is for the ones that you can't solve. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. If you look at it and you're like, I have no idea what's going on here, then that's an X. If you do your practicing in the order I'm going to lay out for you, this you shouldn't have that many of these. Um, but yeah, it is a good way to fill in gaps. And then C is for calculator only, which means that maybe you can solve the problem, but the only reason you can solve the problem is because you have like a calculator program or something. Like if you didn't have a calculator, or maybe you only had like a 4-function calculator, you wouldn't be able to solve it. But since you have the program, then you can solve it. Those are the ones that I mark with a C. Now, this may seem like a little bit of a frivolous step, but like the big idea here is to be able to the identify the difficulty of questions on the fly when you're taking an actual test. And the purpose of this is like, number one, which is oftentimes just like a basic tax problem or solver or something like that, or like algebra equation you have to solve, versus, questions in the calculus and statistics problems where maybe you have to solve like a logistic differential equation, you know, uh, they're both worth 6 points. They're both worth the same number of points. And so being able to quickly identify which ones are Q's and S's will help you not waste time or really, really help, depending on your level, obviously. But being able to identify the difficulty of a problem will drastically increase the number of problems you answer per test and like the percentage of problems that you answer on a test. Right? I think we've all had that meet where you look at the test after the fact and look at one you skipped and you're like, wait, that was actually super easy. Right? And so like there's no amount of just regular practicing that you could do that would prevent that. Right? Because if you knew how to solve it, like what are you going to practice? Like know how to solve it like better? Like the process is going to be the same. But going through like this, being able to identify the quick ones will help you avoid that. And then I'm going to go into this a little bit more later, but you want to start focusing on the next section. So maybe you're on 1 through 20. Start focusing on the next section whenever you can answer around 17 out of those 20 problems. I will talk about this a little bit more in detail because it is a little bit more nuanced than this, at least in my experience. But let's see what's next. Oh, yes. Now we're going to talk about what you do for each type of problem that you mark. So for the Q's, I would say solve with whatever you have at your disposal. Whatever you do when taking a test, go ahead and do that. Use your calculator programs, pencil and paper, do it in your head, like whatever you would normally do, right? It's quick. The point of this is to just make maybe now the 30-second problem, you try to see if you can solve it in 28 seconds or 25 seconds. Just cut down little bits of time. It is still important to work these because every once in a while you'll hit a Q that you're like, oh wait, it's actually a slight variation on what I'm doing. And you realize maybe it's not actually a Q, in which case you have to figure out how to solve it. So even if you mark it as a Q and you're like, oh, this is easy, I can solve this, still solve it. Like worst case scenario, you get marginally faster at something you already know how to do. Best case scenario, it's actually a little bit different, and now you see this problem at a slightly different angle. All right, for the S's, I would say solve with pencil and paper first, or just like with the basic operations on your calculator, right? Don't use any of like your computer algebra system functions like a solver or a graph. So solve with pencil and paper first. And then after this, I would work it with your graphing calculator or your solver or whatever you want. And try to make a judgment about which one is faster. Try to make a judgment about which one is faster. And because a lot of times when you solve it with pencil and paper, you'll realize, oh wait, I can actually make this shortcut. And the point of it is to just try to turn some of these S's into Q's by doing it in both ways. And then for C, for the calculator ones, I would say if the program helps you solve a problem that you don't yet have the background for, just go ahead and use the program, right? I mean, this is a little bit weird, but this won't happen very often. Again, if you follow the strategy I'm going to outline a little bit further down the line. This won't happen that often if you do have the background. So maybe it's like you can tell it's an algebra problem and you've studied algebra, but it's just like a little bit of a weird part of algebra that you're not really familiar with. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but then go learn how to do the problem because you do have the foundations for it, assuming you've gone through the Khan Academy lessons. And then make a judgment as to what's faster, right? Sometimes when you're working through it, you find out it actually is faster than the program. It's kind of the same as the S, honestly. And I realized that I've made a typo here. Okay, what this is supposed to say. Okay, so for the X's, obviously, those are the ones you don't know how to do. I would say, again, this isn't going to happen very often where you have an X and you're like, I absolutely have no idea how to do this. If you do what I'm going to be talking about a little later. This won't happen very often. But if it does, it's kind of the same as the C. Like if you're looking at it and you can recognize that it's part of the math that you studied before, if you can recognize that it's part of the math you studied before, go out and try to learn it. This will also happen a lot more with like your miscellaneous problems, including like number theory and probability. That's probably the two most common ones to have in this category. In which case, number theory and probability, there's not too many like fantastic resources out there for learning those. There are like the art of problem solving books, but for a lot of people those can be intimidating and they're significantly more difficult than UIL tests. But then again, if you solve the really difficult problems, um, then the ones on UIL are going to seem trivial. So it's really up to you. Okay, moving on a little bit. Oh, yes. And this also works way better if you have a study group, because what you can do is once you've worked through the problems, you can compare what you put Q, S, C, or X on. And right, like if you put C on one of the problems, right? Say you put C on one of the problems, which means that you can solve it, but you need a calculator to do it. If your friend put a Q on it, I mean, that means that they probably have a quick way of doing it without the program. Maybe it's like a special variation of the problem. They could do it without the program. And then all of a sudden that C that might not actually have been that quick just turned into one of your quick problems. So that's the benefit of working with a group. All right. Well, when you're going through this, you're probably going to get some questions, right? Even if it's like a Q or an S, you might still be wondering, well, is there a faster way than this? And I would say there's three big resources. One is going to be the Texas Math Mundo Discord. For those of you that I referenced them, I referenced this Discord in my other two videos. But there's this guy. He's a coach at Pasadena High School, and he has set up this community over the past few years of just like really great math students, like UIL competitors on like, and then we're all in this community, and a lot of people find it very useful because like you post a question and usually they have an answer for you by the end of the day at the latest. Again, like these people are busy, but they do love math and they love helping with math. So that's a good resource, especially for students. The other thing that I'm sure you're already pretty familiar with by now is my channel. Sometimes I've made specific solutions for different tests, like I made some for like the later test last year, like district and region. And then your other option is just to leave a comment on a video and you can ask if there's a better way to do something. And then for coaches, you can email me directly. I'll be leaving my email in the description of this video. It's just investigative.math@gmail.com. This is probably the best way for coaches to get in contact. I know a lot of coaches aren't going to be too familiar with Discord, and I mean, I guess the coaches can still comment on YouTube videos, but for coaches, um, this is probably the best for them. Okay, so now we're going to start looking at the reason why you're not going to find that many X's and C's. Okay, so we're going to talk about the math for each section. So number 1 through 20 is mainly going to be your Algebra 1 and your geometry. Number 21 through 40 is going to be your Algebra 2 and pre-calculus. Plus they're going to start introducing the counting and probability, like the basic probability and counting. And then 41 through 60 will be your calculus BC and statistics. And now you might be asking, okay, like where do I start? Like no one's going to be starting with a clean slate, right? You might have like maybe you're in pre-calculus right now and you have a pretty good foundation in geometry and algebra 1. But you're taking pre-calculus right now and it's like, well, do I go back to 1 through 20 and make sure I can get all those, or do I keep going on pre-cal and work on 21 through 40? Well, here's some guidelines. I would say you should work on the first column if you have not completed Algebra 1 and Geometry, or you cannot answer at least 17 out of 20 correct in 30 minutes. So not completed Algebra 1 and Geometry. That means that before moving on to the second column, you should have completed Algebra 1 and Geometry like on Khan Academy, you have like 100% mastery, and it tracks that for you. You don't have to make that judgment for yourself. Um, yeah, so if unless you have um, unless you have gotten 100% mastery in Algebra 1 and Geometry, um, and you can answer at least 17 out of 20 correct in 30 minutes out of those first 20, then I would say don't move on to the second column. You can still keep working on the first column, get your speed up. And also, no, this is not a typo. Like, I know that the math test is 40 minutes. The reason for this is because, like, in the later parts of the test, there are going to be some easier questions, right? Just because algebra and geometry are in the first column does not mean it can't show up later. So, like, some of your algebra and geometry problems will show up in the second column, not really in the third, but definitely in the second. So those extra 10 minutes give you the opportunity to get some of those easier questions hiding in the later parts of the test. Then for the second column, I would say stay in the second column if you've not completed Algebra 2 in pre-calculus, or you cannot answer at least 30 out of 40 correct in 30 minutes. And then for the third column, that's for if you have not completed calculus and statistics, or you cannot answer at least 15 out of 20 on the third column in 15 minutes. So I guess I haven't said it explicitly here, but the idea here is that if you've made it past the first column, right, you've completed Algebra 1 and Geometry, you can answer 17 out of 20 correct in 30 minutes, right? Then when you're moving on to the second column, each step kind of has like two sub-steps. So for example, the first column, your first like sub-step is to just go through Algebra 1 and Geometry on Khan Academy, right? And then by the time you're actually going into the test, marking those XCs, X, S, C, and X, that's hard to say sometimes. Before you actually go in marking those, you should already have the full foundation of what can be asked there, right? That's not to say that if you're taking a test, you can't go into the second and third column. I'm just saying that it will make your actual practice tests much more effective. It'll make your practice time a lot more effective if you've already learned this. So then once you finish the first column, then you move on to the second column. And the first thing that you do is that you go through Algebra 2 and Pre-Calculus on Khan Academy. And then after you've got 100% mastery on those, then you go and you try to get to the point where you can answer at least 30 to 40 correct in 30 minutes. Okay? And then same thing for the third column. Right? And then once you finish the third column, I would really say just try to like gradually increment these down to the point where maybe you're saying like, I don't know, I guess a good thing would be like third column down to 10 minutes. If your goal is like a perfect score, then maybe you get the third column down to like 10 minutes, and then first and second column down to like together down to 30 minutes, and then give or take a minute or two from one or the other. So I mean, but if you can answer every question, your only problem is speed, then that's a lot easier to fix, right? That's just practice time and getting quicker on your calculator and figuring out which problems are quicker on the calculator versus on paper. So that's some guidelines on like how you can start progressing through your journey. And this is why you're not going to have that many of those C's where you can only solve it with your calculator, or the X's where you just have no idea how to solve it. Because if you're going through Algebra 1 and Geometry before you're actually starting to look at tests, right, then that 1 through 20 is mainly Algebra 1 and Geometry. And so you already have that foundation, and maybe there's like one or two of those problems that aren't mentioned on Khan Academy, right? Those would be the X's, and then you just go look up how to do it. But the thing is that they're still Algebra 1 and Geometry, so they're still rooted in the same kind of basic concepts that you already have a foundation for. So by taking this step first, it's just going to make the whole process so much easier. Okay. Oh yeah, and then yes, also works for knowing when to move on. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about programs. We're getting close to the end. We're going to talk a little bit about programs. Mr. McCurdy, who's the UIL math director, if you didn't know, he likes it when people use programs. Whenever he was a coach at Argyle, he really encouraged his kids to use programs, and the test is reflective of this. So if you have a kind of problem or a problem or a kind of problem that seems to repeat a lot, you should know that he's like trying to get you to make a program, right? Um, yeah, he's trying to get you to make a program. The flip side of this, though, is that don't make a program like don't take a program from somebody else. In other words, don't make a program for a problem that you couldn't solve if you didn't have the program. Because especially on later tests like district and region, whenever it starts mattering for team advancement and individual qualification, they'll just change. He'll change the problem just ever so slightly so that the program no longer works, right? And a lot of times, like a district this past year, there was a I can't remember off the top of my head. I just remember like the feeling of it during the test. There was a kind of problem that I would normally use a program for because it's pretty fast. But the way that he set it up made it actually way faster, like twice as fast to just like type out normally, right? So this isn't the kind of problem that was on the district test, but like logistic models is a very common version of this. Like the common version of this question, you have to solve for like two different constants and like an exponential equation. And like for those of you that have done it, you know it's kind of a pain. But there's variations of the problem that you can literally just do in your head, right? There's some variations of the problem that are very, very easy. But if you only have a program to solve for logistic models, then you're going to end up wasting time using the program, or the program might not even apply. Okay, so that's my spiel on programs. Okay, so since you clicked on this video, I'm assuming that your goal is to qualify for state. But if it's not, that's okay. I just want to talk about it for a second. So here are the state qualifying scores for last year. In other words, these are the average score that you had to get at region in order to qualify for state. So you need to be top 3 in the region to qualify for state. So like the average third place region score in 1A last year was a 67, 2A was a 125, right? And then on the left here, this is actually how many problems you have to be able to solve in order to make these scores. So you see like 1A through 4A, like you really don't have to be able to solve that many problems, right? Like 1 to 20, that's all algebra and geometry. Maybe there's like one probability question in there, one like set problem in there that you're unfamiliar with. But the point is that like to qualify for state, you really don't have to learn that much math. So like if you're in 1 to 4A, it should not be like an intimidating goal to qualify for state. Granted, like these questions are kind of hard, but the foundations, if you've gone through the process before, your foundations are all there, right? So if you're in 3 or 4A having to answer 25 problems, right? That's all the algebra 1 and geometry. And then I bet that like after number 20, there's probably going to be 5 algebra 1 geometry problems, especially geometry, sprinkled throughout 21 through 40. And then usually in like the statistics and calculus section, there's some like basic questions that's like find the mean of this distribution, or not this distribution, but like they'll give you a list and you have to find like the mean and median or something like that, like something you've known since 4th grade. So it does get trickier going into 5A and 6A. Um, I'm not gonna lie, it does get trickier. 41 problems and 42 problems. But even then, like that shouldn't be too daunting, right? Because the thing that a lot of people complain about these new tests are the calculus and statistics. They're like, oh my gosh, there's so much calculus and statistics. Well, on the average test, you're only having to answer 1 or 2 of these, as long as you have a good foundation in algebra, geometry, algebra 2, and pre-cal. Which, if you're struggling with statistics and calculus, well, you've probably already studied all 4 of those. So going through those things on Khan Academy and making sure, I'm not sponsored, by the way. I wish I was. Um, I've said their name a lot. But making sure you have 100% mastery in just those 4. Maybe you're not fast enough yet. That can be solved, right? We've gone over how to increase your speed. But yeah, it's more than doable. It just takes time. All right, here's some conclusions. I would say speed really does come from knowledge, right? Like you don't have to take a bunch of tests in order to get faster at um, mathematics. A lot of people, especially like number sense students, think that, oh, if I don't take like 10 tests a week, then I'm never going to stand a chance because I don't have enough practice. But in reality, in number sense and in math, as long as you're practicing with intention and using these strategies, making sure you have the foundation before you're going into the actual, before you're going to actually practice the material on the test. The test taking kind of has low utility. I mean, the most that I would recommend, unless you're like at a contest, obviously, is just like one is a warm up the day before a contest. That's probably the most that I would recommend. Um, oh yes, and then when you're taking the test, right? Now you have some experience identifying which ones are the Q's, the S's, the C's, and the X's, right? You should be doing all of your quick problems. Maybe this is a little bit ambiguous depending on how quick the calculator ones are. But you should be doing all your quick problems, right? Go from like the start of the test to the end of the test, right? There was one year at state. It wasn't a McCurdy test, but like one year in middle school, I think. And the question was, if the absolute value of x is equal to 4, what are the possible values of x? And that was the last problem on the test. And you would be shocked how many people didn't answer that question that obviously probably would have been able to solve it. So go through the whole test. It's not going to happen very often, but especially like maybe in the early 40s, there will be a question like find the mean of this set of numbers, right? Like kind of an easy thing. So go through the whole test, do all the quick ones, then the ones that are like solvable, like you have an idea of how to solve it, but you don't have like a straight line path to the answer. And then if you hit all of these, right, which is honestly is a pretty impressive feat. Like if you can do all three of these, the Q's, the S's, and the C's, over the course of a test, like you're gonna be set up for success. Like you're already probably gonna have like a personal best. Um, but then after that, obviously you don't really have that much left to do the X's. And the X's is whenever knowing your calculator can really come in handy because sometimes there's like a thing you can do with um, the graphing function or the solver that can turn those X's into C's. And obviously that's not ideal, but during a test, right, you're just worried about getting the right answer. And the last thing I'll say is that this is not a complete guide. Like if you have techniques that you found over the years that you like, your coaches like, try to integrate them into this guide. I will say, however, that try to stick with the guiding principle of foundations and then the test. Right? At the end of the day, it's a, it's the mathematics contest. And so if you're not studying mathematics first, right? You don't study for the math test. You just study math, right? And then the math test is just how that's like how that's examined, right? So there will be things on the test that are not super common, and that's just because Mr. McCurdy likes certain kinds of problems that aren't that aren't very common. But the math does come first, and so whenever you're looking at strategies that you like to use, just make sure, or you can modify them to fit that philosophy. All right, well, that's the end of the video. Stay consistent, and I'll see you at the state meet. All right, bye-bye.